Picture two contracts. One says, you get deference, priority, and lifelong support, and in exchange, you carry full financial responsibility and give up most of your independence. The other says, you get full independence, your own income, your own decisions, and in exchange, nobody owes you priority or deference. You negotiate everything as equals. Both of those are coherent. What breaks a marriage isn't either contract on its own. It's when one partner is quietly asked to sign both at the same time, full independence when it's convenient, and full old-world deference when it isn't. This is Robbin, and this is The Honest Ledger. Today, we're opening the books on one of the most common complaints men bring to this channel. The feeling that marriage now runs on two incompatible rule books at once, an old one and a new one, switched between depending on which one benefits the moment. We're going to break down exactly where that mismatch comes from, why it's not really about one side being the problem, and what it actually costs a man who doesn't see it coming. One thing needs to be said clearly before we go further, and I'll only say it once. This isn't a video that blames women collectively, and it's not a video that says every marriage runs this way. Plenty of marriages run on one coherent model or the other and work fine. What we're diagnosing here is a specific common dynamic, a mismatch in expectations that either partner can fall into, shaped far more by cultural transition and unclear incentives than by anyone's character. Critique the dynamic, not an entire category of people. Keep that in mind for the next 15 minutes. So let's open the ledger. What's actually being expected on each side and where the books stop balancing. The first entry in the ledger is what I'd call rule-book switching, expecting the benefits of the traditional model and the freedoms of the modern one, without carrying the obligations that come attached to either. In the traditional model, a wife's priority and deference were paired with a husband's full financial responsibility and final say on major decisions. A real trade, whatever you think of it. In the modern model, both partners work, both partners have equal say, and neither one owes the other automatic deference. Also a real trade. The friction shows up when the expectations from column 1 get requested alongside the freedoms from column 2, full independence and no obligation to defer, but still an expectation of being provided for and prioritized the way the old model promised. This isn't usually deliberate manipulation. It's more often the product of growing up with mixed cultural messaging, absorbing be independent and expect to be taken care of from different directions without anyone reconciling the two. Picture a man whose wife works full-time, manages her own finances, and makes her own decisions independently. All fair, all reasonable. But who also expects him to cover the larger financial burden, plan every special occasion, and treat her preferences as the deciding vote in the relationship, without a matching sense that his preferences carry equal weight. What this costs him is confusion at a structural level. He can't tell which rulebook he's actually operating under, so he can never be confident he's meeting expectations, because the expectations themselves keep shifting depending on which model is convenient in the moment. On the ledger, full compliance with two contradictory contracts, which is a debt nobody can ever actually pay off. And this is worth sitting with, because it's not usually a case of bad faith on anyone's part. It's what happens when an entire generation is raised on two competing sets of instructions simultaneously, one from grandparents and older relatives, one from peers and modern media, without anyone sitting down to reconcile them. A man in this position isn't dealing with a dishonest partner most of the time. He's dealing with a partner who's also confused, operating off the same contradictory script from her own direction, expecting independence to be respected and provision to still show up automatically without necessarily seeing the tension in that combination any more clearly than he does. That's precisely why naming the mismatch out loud tends to work better than assuming bad intent. The problem is structural before it's personal. The second entry is the substitution effect, and this is worth understanding because it explains a lot of the current anxiety around marriage from both sides, not just men. For most of history, a spouse was functionally the only efficient way to access companionship, domestic labor, cooking, physical intimacy, and shared parenting. The market simply didn't offer alternatives at scale. That's changed enormously. Food delivery, cleaning services, therapy, casual dating apps, and a much wider acceptance of single life have all lowered the functional cost of staying unmarried, for men and women both. Economists who study marriage rates have pointed to exactly this kind of substitution effect as one factor, alongside changing gender roles in the workforce and shifting social norms, behind declining marriage rates across many developed countries in recent decades. The research is genuinely multi-causal, so treat this as one contributing factor among several, not the whole explanation. What this means practically is that marriage today has to deliver real, felt value to be worth the trade-off for both people, because the old default, you need this structure to access these things at all, mostly no longer holds. What this costs a man who doesn't understand this shift is that he keeps evaluating marriage using an outdated cost-benefit model, either overestimating what a relationship should automatically hand him or underestimating what he needs to actually bring to make the trade worth it for his partner too. On the ledger, an old set of assumptions priced against a genuinely new market. The reframe is that this cuts both directions. If marriage isn't the only access point to a good life anymore, it also isn't the only thing on the table for you either, which is exactly why the version worth choosing has to be worth choosing on its own merits, not out of default necessity. It's worth being honest about what this means for how you should actually be evaluating a relationship in front of you right now. If you find yourself staying in something purely out of fear that the alternative is loneliness, that fear is worth examining rather than automatically trusting, because the alternative to a specific bad relationship was never nothing. It was always a different set of trade-offs, some of which might genuinely serve you better. That's not an argument for giving up easily. It's an argument for evaluating honestly instead of out of scarcity. The third entry is effort asymmetry that gets labeled as equality without actually functioning as equality, a pattern that shows up in a real subset of relationships and deserves to be named plainly when it does. Some households genuinely split domestic labor, decision-making, and emotional management fairly. Others describe themselves as equal partnerships, while one person quietly carries more of the invisible load, the calendar, the emotional temperature, taking the default assumption of who adjusts their schedule when something comes up. This isn't a claim about who does this more across an entire gender. Surveys on household labor distribution have found real variation across couples and countries, and the pattern shows up in both directions depending on the relationship. What matters here is recognizing it in your specific situation rather than assuming it away because the word equal gets used. Picture a couple where both partners work full-time, both call the relationship equal, and yet one of them is the only one who ever notices the fridge is empty, remembers the anniversary, or manages the emotional aftermath of an argument with either family. What this costs the person carrying the extra load is a slow erosion of goodwill, because unacknowledged effort compounds into resentment even when nobody intended unfairness. On the ledger, real, sustained labor entered under a label, equal, that doesn't match the actual books. The reframe is to periodically and honestly audit the actual division of labor in your specific relationship out loud together, rather than assuming the label is doing the work the label claims to describe. A useful exercise here is genuinely mundane. Sit down once a quarter and each independently list, without discussing it first, everything you handle in the relationship on a regular basis, then compare lists. The gap between the two lists, more often than not, is where the real conversation needs to happen. The fourth entry is the incoherence around financial expectations specifically, a narrower version of the rulebook problem, but common enough to deserve its own entry. In a fully traditional model, one income covering the household made sense because one partner wasn't earning. In a fully modern dual income model, shared financial responsibility makes equal sense. The mismatch shows up in households with two incomes, where financial obligation is still expected to run mostly one direction, with one partner's earnings treated as the household's baseline and the other's treated as discretionary or optional. Picture a marriage where both partners work comparable hours, but every major purchase decision defaults to one partner's approval, while the other partner's spending is rarely questioned in return. What this costs is a financial relationship that looks equal on a joint bank statement but functions as one-directional in practice, which tends to surface as resentment during any financial stress rather than during the good years. On the ledger, contributed income without a matching contribution to financial authority or accountability. The reframe is straightforward. Financial partnership has to be genuinely bidirectional if it's going to be called a partnership at all. And that's a conversation worth having explicitly rather than assuming it'll sort itself out. The fifth entry is the complaint and criticism pattern that a lot of men describe experiencing without quite having language for it. A dynamic where effort is consistently met with critique rather than acknowledgement, regardless of how much was actually delivered. Relationship researchers, including John Gottman's decades of work on marital stability, have identified persistent criticism and contempt as among the strongest predictors of relationship breakdown when they become the default mode of communication. And importantly, this pattern isn't gendered in the research. Either partner can fall into it, and either partner can be on the receiving end. What matters is recognizing the specific pattern in your specific relationship. Is effort acknowledged some of the time, or is the default response always what's missing rather than what's present? Picture a man who consistently handles a long list of responsibilities well and hears about the 2 things he didn't get to every time, with no corresponding acknowledgement of the 15 things he did. What this costs him is a slow disincentive to keep trying, because effort that's never acknowledged stops feeling worth investing. On the ledger, consistent output met with consistent critique, a ratio that erodes motivation on either side of a marriage. The reframe is to name this pattern directly and specifically when you notice it, not as an accusation, but as an observation. I've noticed the last few things I've done haven't really been acknowledged, and I want to understand why. Gottman's research puts a rough number on this dynamic that's worth knowing, even loosely. Stable couples tend to maintain a substantially higher ratio of positive to negative interactions than couples heading toward separation, often described as somewhere in the range of 5 positive interactions for every negative one during ordinary day-to-day life. The exact ratio varies by study and shouldn't be treated as a strict formula, but the underlying point holds regardless of the precise number. A relationship where acknowledgement is rare and critique is constant is measurably different in the data from one that's built to last. The sixth entry is what happens when deference and respect get treated as automatically earned, rather than something maintained on both sides. In a coherent traditional framework, deference was tied to a specific, defined role and the obligations that came with it. In a modern framework without that explicit structure, respect and consideration have to be actively maintained through behavior on both sides, because neither side automatically owes the other anything by default. Some relationships drift into a pattern where one partner expects the deference of the old model without either party doing the ongoing relational work that used to justify it. Picture a marriage where one partner expects their preferences to consistently take priority, without a matching investment in making the other partner feel prioritized in return. What this costs is a relationship running on an assumption neither partner has actually agreed to out loud, which produces quiet resentment, because the expectation was never explicit enough to negotiate. On the ledger, deference expected without a defined obligation attached to it. The reframe is to make expectations explicit early. What does respect look like day to day for both of you specifically, rather than relying on inherited assumptions that were built for a completely different structure? The seventh entry is the financial exposure that shows up specifically around long-term spousal support, which matters most for men who eventually consider leaving a marriage that isn't working. Depending on jurisdiction, length of marriage, and income disparity, spousal support obligations can be significant and can extend for years after a marriage ends. The specifics vary enormously by location and case, so treat this as a pattern worth researching in your own jurisdiction, rather than a fixed number. This isn't a claim that spousal support is unfair in principle. In many cases, it exists precisely to correct for one partner having sacrificed career growth for the household. What it means practically is that the financial structure of a marriage isn't fully understood by most people entering one on either side. Picture a man who assumed that if a marriage ended, both parties would simply walk away with what they individually earned, only to learn during an actual divorce that the calculation is considerably more complex than that. What this costs him is decision-making at the most important moments of his life, done without accurate information. On the ledger, a major financial commitment entered without a plain language briefing on the actual terms. The reframe, again, is due diligence. Understand the real financial structure of marriage in your jurisdiction before you need to, not after. This isn't about walking into a relationship already planning its ending. It's closer to how you'd treat any other major binding financial commitment. You'd read the terms of a mortgage before signing it, even if you had every intention of paying it off happily for 30 years, and the fact that you loved the house wouldn't be a reason to skip the paperwork. The eighth entry, and the one that actually resolves most of what's come before it, is that the way out of rulebook switching isn't picking a side and enforcing it. It's making the rulebook explicit before you're both operating on assumptions. Couples who function well long-term across both traditional leaning and modern leaning arrangements tend to share one trait more than any other. They've actually discussed out loud what each of them expects, financially, domestically, emotionally, rather than assuming it from cultural osmosis. Picture two couples with nearly identical circumstances, where the only real difference is that one couple had an explicit conversation early about how they'd split finances, labor, and decision-making, and the other assumed it would work itself out. 5 years later, that one conversation is often the difference between a relationship that feels fair to both people and one that doesn't. What this means is that the entire mismatch we've spent this video diagnosing is, in a real sense, a communication failure dressed up as a gender conflict. And communication failures are fixable in a way that the other side is the problem never is. On the ledger, this is the entry that actually pays out clarity, negotiated explicitly instead of assumed silently. The ninth entry is what I'd call selective tradition, picking and choosing which parts of an older relationship model still apply in whichever direction is convenient, without acknowledging that traditions came as a package rather than an a la carte menu. The traditional model wasn't just he provides, she's cared for. It also came with clearly defined authority, clearly defined roles, and clearly defined obligations running in every direction, not just toward the person receiving deference. When a relationship keeps the parts of tradition that feel good and discards the parts that feel restrictive on either side without an honest conversation about the trade, the result is a structure that borrows legitimacy from a system it isn't actually operating under. Picture a relationship where he should be the provider, gets invoked during financial conversations, but he should have final say, never gets invoked during decision-making conversations. The first half of the old package kept, the second half quietly dropped. What this costs both partners is a relationship built on selectively remembered rules that can be invoked or ignored depending on who benefits in a given moment, which makes genuine trust difficult to build because the actual operating system of the relationship keeps changing shape. On the ledger, tradition, cited selectively rather than adopted fully, which functions less like a shared value system and more like a moving target. The reframe is to pick a real coherent model on purpose, traditional, modern, or some third thing you actually design together, rather than reaching for whichever half of tradition happens to be useful in the moment. Add it all up and here's the full ledger. What rulebook switching extracts from either partner depending on the relationship, confusion about which contract is actually in effect, an outdated cost-benefit model applied to a genuinely changed market, unacknowledged effort mislabeled as equality, one-directional financial authority dressed up as shared finances, motivation eroded by a criticism to acknowledgement ratio that never balances, deference expected without a defined obligation to earn it, major life decisions made without accurate financial information, and a relationship built on tradition cited selectively rather than adopted as a coherent whole. What it hands back, if nobody names any of it out loud, resentment on both sides, and a marriage that quietly fails a test neither partner ever agreed to take. Now here's what you actually do with this, because diagnosis without action is just a longer way of feeling stuck. First, get explicit before you assume. Have the actual conversation, early, calmly, specifically, about what each of you expects financially, domestically, and emotionally, instead of letting inherited cultural scripts fill in the blanks for you. Second, periodically audit the real division of labor in your specific relationship out loud together, rather than trusting the label equal to describe something nobody's actually checked lately. Third, name the criticism to acknowledgement ratio when you notice it skewing calmly and specifically as an observation rather than an accusation. I've noticed effort isn't really being acknowledged lately, and I want to understand why, not. You never appreciate anything. Fourth, get informed about the actual financial and legal structure of marriage in your jurisdiction before a crisis forces you to learn it under pressure. That's not pessimism. That's the same due diligence you'd apply to any major contract. Fifth, stop evaluating relationships against an outdated cost-benefit model built for a world where marriage was the only access point to companionship and stability. That world doesn't fully exist anymore, which means the relationship you're in or choosing to enter has to earn its place on its actual merits, not on default necessity. And sixth, remember that most of what looks like an unbridgeable conflict between two people is actually two unstated rulebooks running in parallel. The fix usually isn't picking a winner. It's putting both rulebooks on the table and agreeing explicitly on one. And seventh, if you're going to draw on tradition at all, draw on the whole thing on purpose rather than the convenient half of it. Sit down together and actually design the model you're both operating under. Which parts of older structures you want to keep, which parts of modern structures you want to keep, and which obligations come attached to each, rather than letting the rulebook get assembled by default, one convenient exception at a time. None of this is a reason for despair, and it's definitely not a reason to give up on marriage as a structure. It's the opposite. Once the rulebook is explicit instead of assumed, most of this friction has somewhere to go besides resentment. So here's my question for you, and I want something specific in the comments, not just event. Where have you actually seen this rulebook switching show up in your own relationship or a relationship close to you, and did naming it out loud actually change anything? This has been Robbin for The Honest Ledger, the channel that reads the fine print nobody hands you. If this is the first place you've heard this dynamic explained instead of just complained about, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want the rest of the ledger opened up, one entry at a time.